Thank you for coming this afternoon. Thank you to those of you who've had to rush over from the Durbar Hall. I'm absolutely delighted here to talk about one of my favourite subjects, but also one I don't know enough about, which is Greek drama. And I'm lucky to have really, possibly the world's leading expert on the Greeks and their drama in Simon Goldhill. So, Simon, can I start by asking you, what's the first Greek play that you saw read?
That's a wonderful question. I'm very lucky that I had what might be called a Victorian education. That is, that I learned Greek and Latin before I learned English in many ways. And the first play I was given to read, I was aged 11, in ancient Greek. And the play was Hecuba, which is a play about a violent revenge taken by a woman who murders her own child's murderer's children by stabbing them with her brooches. It involves sexual horror, and she ends up being transformed into a dog. When I look back, I cannot imagine what on earth my teachers thought they were doing with an 11-year-old boy. It, however, must have fired something in me, because I can see in my mind now the red book in which the play was, and opening it and seeing that beginning, those first words, and Hecuba lying on the floor in grief as a ghost of her son speaks. So, yes, it was a long time ago that I read my first play, but it's a play that has haunted me ever since.
Okay, take us back to ancient Greece. Where were these plays performed, and when were they performed?
All we call Greek tragedy is, strictly speaking, Athenian tragedy. It all took place in the second half of the 5th century BCE in Athens, which at that time was not only a democracy, and a radical democracy, but it was also an imperial state. It used to travel around the Greek world getting what they called allies, which basically meant you had to fight on their side or get bashed up. And the plays are a major factor in the civic culture of democracy. And one of the reasons why we still find tragedy so exciting is the way it speaks to the politics of democracy.
So who were the audience for this? Well, how democratic was the audience?
Well, I'm sorry to put it like this. The Greeks would have said it was totally democratic, by which they meant men. And no slaves except for one, which I'll come back to. So I'm going to spend 5 minutes just telling about this, because it's actually quite interesting. All the Greek so-called Athenian tragedies or Greek tragedies were only performed pretty well once a year at a festival to Dionysus, the god, called the Great Dionysia. And it was a 5-day festival, and it starts with various processions. We'll then get into what happens on the day itself. But the audience was made up of the citizens of Athens, okay? The citizens of Athens were male enfranchised adults. And when you walked into the Greek theatre, I'm sure you've all seen a picture of an Athenian theatre with that great semicircle of seats. You walked into what you might call a map of the city. What happened was this. In order to get your ticket, and we have those tickets in the museum back in Greece, little lead tokens, you had to go to your deme office, as it were. That is a political subdivision of the state. 3 demes made up a tribe. There were 12 tribes. Now, when you got your little lead ticket, that enabled you to go in. But it also meant that where you sat was with your political unit. Not with your family, not with your mates, with your political unit. And those different wedges of seats, 10 of them were made up of Athenian citizens, tribe by tribe. In the front row, you can always see the most important people. Right? You can see the priests of Dionysus, and most importantly, you could see the generals, the authority figures of the state, because it was a major public occasion. How many people went? How many citizens? It was actually the biggest occasion in the year in which Athenians got together, unless there happened to be a major battle in which they were fighting for the whole city and everybody wanted to fight. How do we know how many people there were? We do it in an incredibly scientific way. We have the size of the theatre, and we sort of measure the seats and then divide it by bum size. They're extremely sophisticated, and that gives you a figure between 10 and 15,000, which is roughly the Athenian population of adult enfranchised men at this period. So they would say the whole city was there. Outside of these very important people, right in the middle, sat the 500 members of the government. It's a democracy. You were appointed to the boule, the council, and that was done by lot. It wasn't a political career, and you were likely to have a go at it at some point in your life. But the 500 members of the boule, the executive body of government, were right there in the middle. You could all see them. You could see the government. That's where the one servant was, who was the clerk of council. And he had his own seat with his own label, which we still have in the Athenian Museum. And that's the one servant. On the far side sat foreigners and metics, resident aliens. So when you walk in, you can see the foreigners. You can see the people who don't quite fit with the rest of society over there. And on the other side, you had an extraordinary group of people called the Athenian war orphans. These were boys whose fathers had died fighting for the state. And we'll come back to them. The simple point is, when you walked into the theatre, you walked into a map of the whole city. Its politics, its culture. The theatre was a place for representing the city to itself. And it did it not just on stage, where all the plays are about city life, but in the audience, in the whole structure, in the whole institution of theatre, was a way of saying, this is Athens, this is who we are. And that's one of the reasons why it talks amazingly to democracy as a system.
What about the actors? What about the people on stage? Who were they?
The actors were citizens. They weren't a demi-monde of disreputable people as they were in Rome, or indeed, one might think, in modern theatre. Right? They were proper citizens who were paid to work for a year on performing this one day. The plays were funded by the system that's known as liturgy. The first thing the government did each year was select 3 playwrights and the people who would fund them. You didn't get a choice. You were picked out. They said, you're rich enough, you fund a play. It was the same way as you're rich enough, you'll fund a ship. And the whole city of Athens didn't have a tax system. It had a compulsory liturgy system, which affected the rich. Very, very good idea, in my view. Right? So they were supported in that way. The theatre was one. But here's the twist. Everybody in the audience was paid to attend the theatre. That is to say, you could claim your rights to go because you were losing your labor. This was for common people. You couldn't say to people, look, take 5 days off to come and see the theatre. I know you're poor. Right? The poor, everybody, the citizens, were given the money for the ticket by the state. Right? This was funded by a particular fund which was called the Theoric Fund. And it was such a protected fund that it was against the law even to propose to change the law. Right? Now, that is what I call ring-fenced arts funding. All right? And there's a wonderful moment in our sources where Demosthenes, the 4th century orator, is speaking about the Athenian war against Philip of Macedon. And he says, we're running out of money for the army. We need money for the army. I can think of a place we could get some more money, but I can't mention it. Right? I.e. the Theoric Fund. The Athenians just said, shut up. They kept the Theoric Fund and lost the war. All right? Interesting idea of what arts means. That is, it was considered sufficiently important to go to the theatre that the state insisted that all citizens go. And this is fantastically interesting that when Demosthenes, again, the 4th century orator, is having a big argument with his great political rival, Aeschines, who had been an actor, in his argument he says, I'm a real citizen, you're not a citizen. And he lists some things that he had done, Demosthenes had done, and Aeschines had not done. And one of the things he says is, I was in the audience. You were merely on the stage. Because what's important is being a citizen, watching, learning. The actors are mere instruments in his ideological projection of what we're talking about.
Well, what about the kind of the third part of this triangle, the actual authors? So they select 3 a year, but there seem to only be about 3. So how does that work?
There were a lot more than 3, for sure, although Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides are the ones we know best. If you got to be dead famous, if you were the Tom Stoppard of Athens, you were very likely to be asked to write a play each year because everybody loved it. So Euripides gets asked every year. He very rarely won a prize because they loved his provocation. They loved going to the theatre, but then didn't vote for it to win, all right? Which was quite interesting. So they were selected, and we just don't know how. All we know is that it happened. The plays were judged in a competition, and winning was a big thing. Plato's Symposium is the party after a stage victory of Agathon. The way the voting worked tells you a lot about democracy. Each tribe had put forward a list of 100 names. Of those 100 names, 10 were chosen at random, which produced a list of 100. Of those 100, 10 were chosen at random. The 10 then got to vote, and they put their votes in. Only 5 of the votes counted, randomized. So you have multiple randomized voting because all citizens are equal. Your judgment is equal. And this extraordinary honor of winning the play came from that system.
No, I also think one of the things that's fascinating about that system is that it shows how completely random lottery is. That I think for a lot of us now, democracy means majority rule, essentially, that you actually count the votes really carefully. But one of the things that is fascinating, in some ways kind of inspiring and very radical about the Athenian democracy is all the ways in which they're not trying to find out what the majority thinks. They're trying to produce a fairly random result, representative of the whole, one way or another, over time, representative of the whole population. But okay, so coming on to the plays themselves, I mean, you've talked about how this is this very brief period, really, when these plays are being performed in Athens, is a time when Athens is an imperial power as well. You've also said that some of these playwrights, at least, are provocative. What do they do with empire?
That's a great question. To explain that, I need to tell you 2 things. The first thing is what actually happened once you'd walked into that map of the city and sat down. Once you got your seat, what happened? Well, the first thing that happened is that you started the festival, as you started every festival in Greece, by sacrificing an animal and pouring a libation. In this particular case, you slit the throats of a group of piglets. You walked them around the theatre, spreading blood around the theatrical space. I spent a year of my life trying to work out what the symbolic value of piglets was, and then discovered it was because they were cheap. So it's easy. The interesting thing about this particular ritual, I'm going to tell you about 4 rituals. The particular thing about this first ritual is that the people who poured the libation were the 10 generals, the 10 leading political figures of the state. That is to say, before you started tragedy, you had the equivalent of the cabinet on stage, right? Like we had the minister right at the beginning of the festival. We had the cabinet on stage, and they very rarely got together to do that sort of thing in public. They did it sometimes for a sacrifice for peace. Well, it's obvious why generals do a sacrifice for peace, but they only did that occasionally. And they also did it for the good luck of the city. Well, obvious again why generals would do that. But every year, they started the drama festival. That's the first thing. It places the festival under the authority of the state very, very firmly. The second thing they did, which was quite extraordinary, is that a group of servants, slaves, came in carrying great lumps of silver, walking them around, and then taking them out of the theatre. This was a ceremony known as the Parade of Tribute. And to understand the Parade of Tribute, you have to 2 seconds on the politics of empire. Okay? Athens was an empire. How did it work? After the Persian Wars, they moved the treasury, the collection of the league that fought the Persians, to Athens. They took financial control. And they used the money to build a fleet. And they took the fleet round to a little island, and they would go, "Little island, hey, look at our beautiful fleet. Would you like to be an ally?" And the little island would go, "Nice forces, yes, we'll be an ally." "Oh," say the Athenians, "the allies pay tribute." "What, we're allies and we pay?" "Yes." They had to send the money. They would take the money and build a bigger fleet and go to a bigger island and say, "Hey, bigger island, can you see our bigger fleet? Would you too like to be an ally?" Yeah, same process. So it goes round and round, a sort of extended protection racket. If you tried to leave being an ally, your city is likely to be destroyed by the Athenian fleet. And you were required to send the money in silver bullion, along with a bull for a sacrifice and a phallus for a procession, at the beginning of the sailing season, which is when the theatre was on, so that you as a foreign ambassador could sit in the front row and watch your money go round. Now, you don't have to be a major political analyst to recognize this was saying something about Athens. We are number one in the Mediterranean. Look at the money. Follow the money. Right? And it doesn't take much to realize that, as Aeschines said in the 4th century, when this no longer took place, he said it was a precise way of being hated by everybody. Right? Not the purpose. That's the second ritual, which is absolutely about the politics of empire. The third ritual was an announcement of everybody who'd won a special honor from the state. And Athenian society was extremely patriarchal, it was extremely competitive, and everybody wanted to be number one man in the state, so being awarded an honor was a great thing. But the way they described it, fascinatingly, in all our texts, is to say the reason why we have this ceremony of presenting an honor in front of the state is to encourage everybody to realize that their duty is to the state. It's not about the individual, it's about how you fight for democracy as an individual. You must be judged according to your contribution to the state. And that's what this is for. So it uses the state festival to glorify the state in a different way. And the final fourth ritual involves those orphans over there, the war orphans, I guess. If your father died fighting for the state, you were declared an orphan. You don't have to remind me that's sort of sexist, okay? If you were a war orphan, you were brought up at state expense. You received weapons and armor at state expense. And when you were 18 and ready to join the army, you were paraded in the theater before the tragedies started, and you took the oath that you too would stand by your colleagues in the army, right, wherever you were placed. It was a moment that took the idea of the military service to the state, imperial service, and dramatized it. As your father died for the state, so you will die for the state. It's extraordinary in Greek. Allow me to do 2 words of ancient Greek, that's where I start. If they said to somebody, prove yourself good, agathoi geneste, prove yourselves to be noble, that is the usual euphemism in Greek for dying for the state. It comes on your tombstone. They proved themselves good means they died for the state. Right? That is to say that basic value of who you are is determined by your military service, which is how empire works. And indeed, almost everything you did in life in Greece was passed through this militarism. Why do you go to the gym? I assume you all go to the gym. Why do you go to the gym? In order to prepare yourself for war. Why do you go dancing? In order to prepare yourself for war. Why do you get on with people? Because Socrates went up to somebody in the street, we have this text in Xenophon, he said, "You're looking a bit flabby. Don't you realize that your body is an instrument of the state? Don't you realize that by being flabby, you're letting down the side, and your death may cause the death of others because you're not fit enough to fight?" Socrates got put to death, right? Eventually, right? For this sort of talk. But there we are, the idea that you are a committed member of a military empire is absolutely crucial to the Athenian Enlightenment. And our image of Athens tends to be like guys in white sheets wandering around going like, what is justice? But it's a military state, and always was. So it's worth asking, since it's a direct democracy, and you vote yourself into war, like you don't send out disaffected working class people or different people of different ethnicities to fight for you. You go out to fight. You risk your life. So how many years of the 5th century did the Athenians vote themselves into war? Almost every year of the century, and no 2 years in succession without so doing. Right? That gives you a sense of what war is like for them. So 4 amazing ceremonies, all about projecting and promoting the values of the democratic imperial state.
What about the plays?
And then we get to the plays. And what's amazing is what happens next. Because what happens next is tragedy and comedy. In comedy, I'm going to talk mainly about tragedy. I have one sentence on comedy because I can sum it up very quickly. Comedy, you stand up on stage, you look at the people in the front row who are terribly important, and go, fuck you! That is the rough translation of most of Aristophanes. All right? You name people in the audience, you go, I hate, and you name a politician. I won't dare do that here. Right? And you name the politician and you say he's an idiot, he's sexually perverse. Blah. That's comedy. But tragedy is more interesting to me.
Do you work on tragedy, Simon?
I work on both, but tragedy might be that. So the thing about tragedy is that it shows you play after play where the state collapses. Play after play where your commitment to militarism is shown to be false or wrong or corrupt or immoral. It displays the city in disastrous state. So how could it be that in a major state occasion, the whole state's there, you've just done 4 ceremonies going, yay, democracy, yay, Athens, and then you put on plays that are full of disastrous, murderous, corrupt collapse? Well, partly it's that these plays are never set in Athens. It's always about over there in Thebes, they're corrupt, they're terrible, they sleep with their mothers, they kill their fathers, right? That's what happens in Thebes. So you could say, it's the good story, the bad story. Here's democracy, here's the ritual, here's the play, that's where it goes wrong. That would be absolutely fine if that's what the plays did. But they don't. What the plays do is to show you Oedipus, who sleeps with his mother and kills his father. But they also say directly that Oedipus is an example for all of us. When Freud said Oedipus is everybody and everybody is Oedipus, he was just translating Greek. He wasn't making up psychoanalysis, right? It's really important that every character in Greek tragedy speaks to you. You constantly think, as it were, that tragedy is about the suffering of others. Remember in Hamlet, in the middle of Hamlet, the play within the play, where Hamlet comments, what's Hecuba to him that he should weep? Right? Why do we relate to other people's troubles? Well, the thing about tragedy that's so remarkable is it represents other people's troubles but makes it about you. It twists past your censor, past what you think, I know this, and gets you. And that's why it's so remarkable. And if I gave one example from Oedipus, I would say the play is most famous in modernity for being about irony. We sit in the audience and we watch a man who is pursuing the killer of Laius, and he doesn't know it's his own father, and he doesn't know he's done the killing. So for most people, you would say they sit back in the audience and they calmly watch the disaster unfurl. But that's not how the play works. Because the play works by saying to you, when he came to the crossroads, he thought he knew what he was doing. You think you know what you're doing? You think you're in control of your life when you approach the crossroads? What sort of an idiot are you to believe you're in control of your own life? That's to say, we have a fantastic set of ceremonies that say, the state is right, the state wins, this is how to be a good citizen. And then we have a series of plays that go, I don't think you've begun to think about this. You don't know what you're doing. And that, to me, is the most remarkable thing about Greek tragedy, that ability to take a state occasion and twist it into a set of really hard questions, real difficulty. You never know in Greek tragedy whether what you're doing has been fated by the gods, whether it's your own choice, whether you control the action or not.
Well, I mean, another kind of paradoxical aspect, it can certainly seem like a paradox in Greek tragedy, is the role of women. So, you know, these plays are happening in this civic world where women don't have a vote, you know, have very little public role, really. And yet, in a lot of, not all of them, but in a lot of these tragedies, very powerful women taking center stage, taking many of the lines. What's that about?
Well, I think one of the things that tragedy is most interested in doing is really exploring a sense of masculinity that is central to being a citizen, as a fighter, as a politician, as the head of a family. You know, famously, Socrates is said to have said of other people too, so it may not have been said of him, I thank God that I was not born a foreigner, a woman, or, I've forgotten the third now, but something negative. And if we go to a particular example, it might help to explain what I mean about challenging the stability of masculinity. A play like Medea is one of the most popular plays ever put on in the 20th century, let alone any other time in the 21st century. It's an extraordinary play which ends up with Medea killing her own children in order to get back at her husband who has decided to marry someone else. In that play, Medea comes out on stage having been screaming on the inside, and she starts to speak to the chorus of women, and she lays out the case of what it's like to be a woman. She says, "Gunakes esmenes liotiton futon," we women are the most wretched of races. And she goes through the horrors of female life. And it's often been extracted. In the 70s, it was often extracted for a feminist set text, as it were. What she's doing is persuading the chorus to be on her side as she prepares her plot. And they fall for it. We then have a series of scenes with Medea when she meets, first of all, the king. And she persuades him to give her one extra day. She's going to be exiled. He says, I think I might be making a mistake here. Boy, does he not know what a mistake he's making. She then gets to meet her husband and has a screaming match with him. She then gets to meet a visiting Athenian, Aegeus, who gives her a home in exile. And she persuades him to do that. She then persuades her husband that she's changed her mind and she's happy with what's going on. And she's going to give gifts, wedding gifts. The gifts she gives are poisoned and destroy the bride, destroy the children, and destroy the father. She then gets to flee on the chariot of the sun, her grandfather. That's to say, every scene of the play shows Medea dominating the action by virtue of her words. My weapons are my words, she says. Right? She uses words to get what she wants and then drugs to kill when she needs to kill. She is completely dominant over Jason, the man of the golden fleece, the man of the Argonauts. She's completely dominant over the king of Corinth. She's completely dominant over the Athenian who's offering her exile, who doesn't realize he's bringing a murderous psychopath into his city. And yet, she exits the stage in triumph. There is no punishment for Medea beyond the expected history of misery she's going to have from what she's done. She ends up carrying her dead children, going, look at me, I've won. What does that do to the men in the audience? Right? That's what the play is suggesting, that I'm suggesting the play is doing. It's offering a real question about, you thought you were a rhetorician, you thought the words were your power? Look, you can't control this. You thought you were the head of a household? You can't control this. You thought you were a military leader? Look what's just happened. The play remains deeply terrifying and disturbing, not just because what Medea does, but because it offends everybody's sense of justice. That Medea kills her own children to do what she wants. And I take that back. I've had one case when I was teaching in America, and I said to the class, who thinks here it would be right to murder your boyfriend if he cheats on you? And one girl said, I would. And everybody in the class went, whoa, and moved their seats away. But in general, we have a different ethical system that suggests that would be over the top.
It should be a question on the dating apps. But I mean, so this brings up, I think, a really interesting question about the modern reception. You said Medea incredibly popular in the 20th century. Greek tragedy in general, very popular. So it had this resurgence of popularity between the 19th, 20th, still in the 21st century, incredibly popular. Does it matter that we're watching it, hearing it, reading it now in such a different context that do we have the same, is it popular for the same reasons?
I think a lot of the plays you see that pretend to be Greek tragedy involve men in black shouting at each other, and I hate that. If you can get to the real heart of a play and understand what's going on, and understand the real tensions and the violence within the play, it still has absolute power to move. I will give one example, a very famous example, of Fiona Shaw in Derry, in Ireland at the time of the Troubles, putting on Sophocles' Electra. Sophocles' Electra is one of the most brutal and wonderful plays. It's one of my favorites because it's so brutal and so relentless. And it's about the psychological damage that is done to somebody who wants to take revenge, not least revenge against her own mother. And it is so painful to watch. The performance was absolutely extraordinary. Fiona Shaw was magnificent. It's one of the defining performances of the 20th century. But each night that it was put on in Derry in Northern Ireland at the time of the Troubles, where the Civil War, the audience refused to leave. They said, we cannot leave this theatre until we have talked about what you have just done. And every night they had to have a discussion going back because it was so painful for people to watch it. She also heard outside the theatre two boys walking out going, wow, that was amazing. And one turned to the other and said, it's a great play. When did it get written? And the other one said, the 5th century BC. He said, wow, it's taken a long time to get to Derry.
Talking about travelling long distances, your most recent book that we were just hearing about, Queer Cambridge, it's a very, it might seem a very different topic, a very different place from 5th century BC Athens. I mean, is there a story about a journey there, academic kind of journey for you?
Yes, I think so. I've spent a lot of my life in King's College, Cambridge, which is the centre of Queer Cambridge, and always has been. I think it's something we've been talking about a bit with Stephen Fry, talking about the sense in which you might belong or not belong in a community. Tragedy is about really exploring the boundaries of belonging, the boundaries of commitment, the boundaries of do you know what your identity is. Right? It's a great moment in Euripides' Bacchae when Dionysus the god in disguise says to Pentheus the hero, you don't know who you are. And he says, I'm Pentheus. I'm the son of Agave. I live at 21 Guest Road, whatever. At the end of the play, his mother, who is mad, sees him and he shouts, Mummy, it's me, Pentheus. And she rips his arm off. Right? There's a moment in which if you think the answer to the question, who are you, is I'm Josephine Quinn, you haven't begun to understand tragedy, all right? So
you're in trouble for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, right. And so that sense of not knowing how you fit in, not knowing where you go, not knowing whether the community, even the community that nourishes you, actually makes you feel belonging, is something that all the people I've written about in Queer Cambridge felt. They were there as people when it was illegal to be homosexual, as it was then called. It was also socially denigrated, and you could get into not only legal trouble, but immense social trouble if you were outed in any form. Yet for some way, King's College and other bits of Cambridge managed to stage that. It managed to make a place when you could be somehow gay and out and open in private, or in a public-private place. And so for me, I think there is a sort of continuity about how community is formed and what your engagement with community is. I think, if I might finish with or stop towards, fine. So I suppose if you think about most of modern television or most of modern arts of a popular nature, the idea that you might ask seriously hard questions about your own ideology and silly provoke people is very rare. Happens, but it's very rare. I'm sure we can all think of good examples, but the majority of what we see on television or what we see on videos is pap. And one thing I find most extraordinary about the tragedy is its ability to take a popular festival of the whole city, and make it a really hard place to think about yourself. I think that's really a remarkable sense of what the politics of democracy are. And that's, for me, is why I keep studying it. So.
Great. That seems like a good moment to go to questions from you. We have been asked to emphasize this is a question and not a speech session. But please put your hands up. I think I saw, yep, one down here to start off with. Lady in the pink there.
Hello. Thank you so much for a great session. My question was, do you think that media is a reflection of deep misogyny within the Greek... Sorry, do you think media, the Greek play that you were mentioning, is a reflection of the deep misogyny in the Greek culture, society at that point?
It's a very interesting question. In Aristophanes' plays, the comedies, which are contemporary with Euripides, they constantly make fun of Euripides for being a misogynist. That becomes a joke in Victorian culture, in Athenian 5th century culture. Oh, Euripides is a misogynist, look what he does. Why was he a misogynist? Well, according to Aristophanes, because he showed women in a very bad light. For most modern playwrights, it's put on because it's a searing indictment of the stupidity of men and the impossibility of their own behavior. But what makes it tragedy is that Medea is a self-destructive heroine. Tragedy often leaves you no place to stand. It says you want to be, you think you've got gender sorted, you can't be either a man or a woman after you've seen Medea. There's nothing nice about it at all. And the most interesting character, at some sense, in Medea, for me, is the chorus. Each Greek tragedy had a chorus of singing people. And the chorus in Medea are women who are persuaded by Medea that her husband is a total shit, and yes, she should punish him. And they go, yes, we're with you, Medea, we'll follow you. And they follow her 2/3 of the way down the play going, yeah, he's horrible, look at that, what a slime you get when you don't like him. And then she says, and I'm going to kill my children. And they go, hang on, no, that's not what we signed up for. We were sympathetic, but we didn't think you were going to turn out to be a terrorist. We're going to kill your children, right? And so the trouble is that's always, if you like, the chorus is almost like a model for the audience. The moment you start empathizing with someone in tragedy is the moment you're about to lose your sense of control again. So I don't think it's a sign of misogyny. I do think Athenian society had a real problem with misogyny, but I don't think it's reflected in that way in this play. There's one there.
Question over here, there. Gentleman in the grey top.
And there's one there. Sorry, just make sure you get that.
Hi. So my question is on Virgil and Orpheus and Eurydice and how that's a universal theme. How did it cross so many continents? In India, we have two, Ruru and Satyavati and even in Japan. And how is it so universal?
Sure. Well, Orpheus and Eurydice, for those that don't know, Orpheus was the famous bard who could sing to make the trees listen, the birds listen, the animals listen. And he loved Eurydice, who died, but he went down to the underworld to bring her back up. He was told under no circumstances should you turn around, and he can't resist turning around and loses her again. So it's a very sad and tragic story. One of the things that's fascinating about it is that it's a story about the return of a poet and a poet returning, bringing back voice. And every time we do Orpheus, we bring back another voice. We do it again. And every generation since the early Orphic times, and it's already a story in the 5th century BCE, every poet loved to retell that story. So it goes off into Virgil, it goes off into Ovid, it goes off then into opera, the great Gluck opera, which started Che senza Euridice, which is the great famous, one of the most famous opera songs, leader of the arias of the 18th century. And it comes all the way up into modernity with the songs, all the way up into modern poetry with the Orpheus Lieder of Rilke. I think it travels because it speaks so powerfully to the sense of longing and loss, that you long for someone who's died. You could get them back if only you could find the right words, but then you lose them again because your desire and your longing overtakes and produces a sense of loss. And that's both a great psychological lure, and at the same time, for anybody who writes, it's an extraordinary lure to think about how whatever you write is a rewriting of someone else's story, and can you find a way to get your own voice? And do you always lose your own voice? Do you find your own voice? And I think that's one of the reasons why Orpheus has been such an attraction to literary people.
Yes. Down here at the front, please.
Turquoise.
You've talked before about the impact of these perfect figures of naked male statues on the everyday man trying to become the ultimate perfect citizen. I just wondered if you could give us a bit more on that.
Yes, certainly. I've described the political rituals that made the festival political, and I've described the way in which tragedies were really provocative. It's not the only way in which, as it were, ideology gets projected in the city. There are many other ways. We're very used to seeing pictures of impossibly beautiful women, photoshopped to be thin and beautiful with cheekbones and the lot. We're very used to that. It's a common discussion about whether this is destructive to your sense of self-identity or it's an ideal that you try and live up to, or whatever. What's fascinating about ancient Greece is they were surrounded by statues of naked men, not naked women. The first naked woman statue was the Aphrodite of Cnidos in the 4th century and was a terrible scandal. And when the statue was made for another city, they refused to take it, and that's why it ended up at Cnidos and became a great tourist site. But men were everywhere. Naked men. Not only naked men, but impossibly naked men, right? Literally impossible. Not just that they didn't have a most of us, I fear, even Willie, doesn't have a six-pack. Right? Even Willie doesn't have a six-pack. But because the bodies that they depict are anatomically impossible. That is that if you've seen a Greek body, you'll know it has something called the iliac crest, which is the fold of muscle over the hip. Now, the fold of muscle over the hip stops at the hip in human males. In Greece, it goes all the way around. So you cannot possibly get like that. You can work out as hard as you like, but you cannot get to that impossibility. And so there's a fascinating way in which, yes, you must train your body. Yes, you must work out. Yes, you're being judged by the way your body looks. And at the same time, you're being offered an impossible ideal. That makes me immediately think of the immense power of Plato over Western thinking. The impossible ideal of the Republic, the impossible ideal of the perfectly just man. For me, one of the most destructive things that I know is idealism. Right? That is to say, idealism when it becomes totalitarianism, when it becomes certainty, when it says there's only one way you can be and this is this. And Plato has become deeply responsible for that in some ways, despite the wonderfully ironic Socrates, despite the beauty of his prose, despite the fact that philosophers will hate me for saying it, I can never forget that Plato was both Stalin's and Hitler's favorite writer. All right?
Time for one more quick one. Yes, the lady in yellow, halfway down.
Thank you for giving me the chance. So we were talking about state politics and theatre. What is your comment or take on the Orestian trilogy? Right from Clytemnestra murdering Agamemnon to Orestian murdering Clytemnestra and Athena justifying it.
That's a lovely question. I'm afraid I've written a couple of books on that. So
You've got 30 seconds.
I'm going to try and be very, very brief. What I would say is it's an extraordinary play because it moves from the family to the state. It starts with criminality within the family, murder within the family, and tries to end up with the state. For some people, it ends up with an ideal state. For me, it ends up with a very, very problematic place where it says, violence is always there. You have to have violence in a city. You can't have a city without conflict. The question is not, can we imagine a city without conflict? The question is, how do you manage it? How do you work with it? And that, to me, is a profound political comment to make to a state. Very few politicians are prepared to say, do you know what? We do live in a messy, conflictual world. It's about getting on with each other. The point of civility, as has been said, is we shouldn't fall over each other's toes. Right now, it's jolly hard in some Indian cities, literally. But Actually, politically, it's extremely important that making do, getting on, is the opposite of idealism and enables you to have a pragmatic way of going forward. And I think that's what the end of the Oresteia suggests is, yes, have a vision, but don't allow that vision to exclude alternative, to exclude doubt, to exclude possibility. Right? So it's maintaining a position in a city, and here I feel very passionate about this, that you should not foreclose potentiality. Right? And that's the great danger of modern politics, that the state is going to be destroyed by trying to be perfect rather than being good enough.
And on that note, we're out of time. Thank you, Simon Goldhill.